Rosie O'Donnell has always been known as a loud, bold, and unapologetic voice in Hollywood. Over the years, she has built a reputation as someone who never shies away from speaking her mind, whether it's on television, in comedy, or on political issues. Recently, she sat down for a highly anticipated interview on 60 Minutes, and many believed this would finally be her chance to speak seriously, to show a more thoughtful side of her personality. Fans were curious to see if Rosie could silence her critics, while her opponents waited for her to slip up. But instead of being the strong, eye-opening conversation that people expected, the interview quickly turned into something completely different. One was supposed to highlight Rosie's strength, ended up making headlines for all the wrong reasons, leaving many wondering if Donald Trump had been right about her all along. In the days leading up to the interview, the media was buzzing with excitement. Rosie O'Donnell was making a comeback moment on one of the most respected television programs, and people expected nothing less than a powerful, eye-opening discussion. Reports suggested that Rosie had prepared extensively, determined to defend her past statements and prove that she was still a sharp, relevant voice in American culture. Her fans believed this would finally be the opportunity for her to clear misunderstandings and show the world that she was more than the controversies attached to her name. On the other hand, her critics were waiting for her to stumble, confident that her outspoken personality would not allow her to maintain a serious tone for long. Rosie walked into the studio with visible confidence, dressed in a way that reflected authority, and smiled as if she already knew she was going to win the room over. The stage was perfectly set for what could have been a turning point in her career, but the reality of what unfolded was far from what anyone had imagined. As the questions began, Rosie initially seemed comfortable, answering with her usual energy and humor. But very quickly, the tone of the conversation shifted. When pressed with serious topics, her responses often felt exaggerated, emotional, and sometimes even contradictory. At one point, she tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but instead of sounding witty, it came across as awkward and forced, leaving the audience more confused than entertained. Viewers noticed that she avoided giving direct answers to certain questions, circling around the topic in a way that felt unprepared and defensive. In another moment, she cited a fact with great confidence, only for it to be challenged immediately by the interviewer, exposing her lack of accuracy. The interview, which was meant to show her strength, slowly began to feel like a comedy sketch. What was supposed to be Rosie's chance to appear serious and composed ended up becoming a series of laughable moments that left the audience questioning her credibility. At the beginning of the interview, everything seemed fine. Rosie was smiling, leaning back confidently in her chair, and giving the impression that she had complete control over the situation. But as the questions became tougher, cracks began to show. When the interviewer asked her about her long history of public feuds and controversies, Rosie tried to laugh it off, saying she was only ever standing up for the truth. Her attempt at humor, however, fell flat. The audience could sense that her laughter was nervous, not genuine. Instead of clearing her image, it almost looked like she was dodging the question. Things went downhill when the interviewer brought up specific incidents from Rosie's past. In one moment, she passionately defended a statement she had made years ago, but as she spoke, her words became scattered and difficult to follow. She repeated the same point again and again, raising her voice as if volume could replace clarity. The more she spoke, the less convincing she sounded. Social media users later replayed that clip, pointing out how her explanation seemed more like a rant than a reasoned response. Another moment that stood out was when she tried to present statistics to support her opinion. She delivered the numbers confidently, but within seconds, the interviewer corrected her, showing that the figures Rosie mentioned were inaccurate. Her expression froze for a moment, and instead of addressing the mistake directly, she brushed it off with a sarcastic comment. What she thought would make her look sharp and witty only made her appear careless and unprepared. Perhaps the most uncomfortable point came when Rosie tried to mix humor into a serious conversation. She cracked a joke at the wrong moment, right after being asked about a sensitive political issue. The silence in the studio was telling. The interviewer's face remained serious, while viewers at home felt secondhand embarrassment. Instead of strengthening her public image, the interview was slowly turning into. By the halfway mark, it became clear that Rosie was not controlling the conversation. The questions were controlling her. Every attempt to appear bold only highlighted her lack of composure. What was expected to be a turning point in her career ended up becoming a turning point in the interview itself, one where the focus shifted from her arguments to her mistakes, and from her confidence to her contradictions. The moment the interview aired, social media platforms lit up with reactions. Instead of viewers discussing Rosie's arguments or praising her courage, most people were sharing short clips of her most awkward and laughable moments. Within hours, hashtags connected to her name started trending, but not in the way she had hoped. Memes were created from screenshots of her expressions, while edits of her stumbling answers circulated widely, gaining millions of views overnight. For many, the interview wasn't seen as a serious conversation. It was entertainment, something to laugh at rather than learn from. Critics who had long opposed Rosie found the interview to be confirmation of everything they had always said about her. Commentators on political talk shows replayed her missteps, describing the interview as a comedy of errors and questioning why she'd agreed to do it in the first place. Even neutral observers admitted that the conversation felt less like a respected 60 Minutes feature and more like a parody sketch. Journalists who had expected a strong headline-worthy defense from Rosie instead reported on the chaotic tone and unnecessary drama that overshadowed the discussion. What surprised many, however, was the reaction from Rosie's own fans. While some tried to defend her by saying she was simply being authentic and real, others admitted that the interview was a disappointment. Longtime supporters confessed that they felt embarrassed watching her struggle, saying it was painful to see someone they admired come across as unprepared. The disappointment cut even deeper because this interview had been marketed as Rosie's big opportunity to rebuild her credibility. Instead, it created more doubt about whether she was capable of handling serious conversations. Clips of the interview spread beyond the United States, making headlines in international outlets as well. Comment sections filled with laughter and sarcastic remarks, with people saying that Rosie had turned 60 minutes into 60 seconds of comedy. What was intended to strengthen her reputation ended up becoming a viral moment of embarrassment. By the end of the week, the public reaction was clear. Rosie O'Donnell's interview had failed to win hearts or change minds. If anything, it had given her critics more ammunition and her fans fewer reasons to keep defending her. No discussion about Rosie O'Donnell's public image feels complete without mentioning Donald Trump. Their rivalry stretches back many years, filled with sharp words, personal insults, and heated exchanges played out on national television. Trump had often criticized Rosie, calling her unpredictable, overly emotional, and someone who never knew how to handle pressure. At the time, many dismissed his comments as part of their personal feud, something rooted in ego and publicity. But after Rosie's 60 Minutes interview, those old remarks suddenly resurfaced, and people began to view them in a new light. Clips of Trump's past statements about Rosie started trending alongside her interview blunders. Viewers began comparing the two, noticing how accurately his descriptions seemed to match her behavior in the interview. When Trump had said she was a disaster waiting to happen, critics pointed to her awkward answers as proof. When he once remarked that Rosie was all talk and no facts, people replayed the moment she stumbled over statistics and was immediately corrected by the interviewer. What had once sounded like harsh insults from Trump now seemed, to many, like predictions that had come true. Even commentators who were not Trump supporters admitted that his words about Rosie felt eerily accurate in hindsight. Talk shows replayed old footage of their clashes, followed immediately by scenes from the 60 Minutes interview, creating a side-by-side comparison that painted Rosie in an unflattering light. For Trump, this moment became a silent victory. He didn't even need to comment. The public was already drawing its own conclusions, with many saying, "Trump warned us about Rosie, and he was right." The connection between the two became so strong that the interview was no longer just about Rosie. It became another chapter in the long-running Trump-Rosie saga, with the public treating it almost like proof that Trump had seen through her all along. Instead of repairing her image, Rosie's performance only strengthened Trump's narrative, giving his supporters one more reason to say that he had been right about her from the very beginning. The media tried to make sense of what had happened. Some outlets, especially those sympathetic to Rosie, attempted to frame the interview as courageous and raw. They argued that she was simply being authentic, showing her real self without worrying about polish or perfection. Headlines used softer language, suggesting that Rosie was unfiltered rather than unprepared. But this spin was not enough to cover up the reality that most people had already seen. The viral clips and endless jokes circulating online told a very different story, one of a celebrity who had turned what should have been a serious platform into an accidental comedy show. Other media organizations were far less forgiving. Critics described the interview as a public relations disaster and questioned why Rosie had even agreed to do it. Analysts on political shows replayed her missteps and called it one of the most uncomfortable interviews in recent memory. They noted how she seemed defensive, off balance, and unwilling to accept responsibility for her mistakes. Instead of repairing her reputation, commentators said the interview only magnified the flaws that had followed her for years. Rosie herself eventually tried to respond. Through social media posts and a short public statement, she insisted that her words had been taken out of context and that the interview had been edited unfairly. She claimed she had spoken from the heart and that people were choosing to laugh at her rather than understand her. But by this point, the damage had already been done. Once the clips went viral, it no longer mattered what her intentions were. The public had already decided how they felt. The aftermath of the interview left Rosie in a difficult position. What was supposed to be a career-defining moment turned into a setback that reminded everyone of her old controversies. Instead of moving forward, she was suddenly being compared to her past mistakes all over again. For the media, the story was irresistible. A celebrity with a history of clashes, giving an interview that seemed to confirm every criticism ever made about her. In the end, the spin could not change the reality. The interview had become one of the most talked about failures of the year. When the dust finally settled, one truth became undeniable. Rosie O'Donnell's 60 Minutes interview had not delivered the outcome she had hoped for. Instead of rebuilding her image, it left her more vulnerable than ever. Viewers walked away not with a sense of respect or admiration, but with laughter and disbelief. The interview had promised depth and seriousness, but what people remembered were the stumbles, the awkward jokes, and the lack of composure that turned a prestigious platform into a spectacle. For Rosie, this was more than just a bad night on television. It became a defining moment that people linked to her entire career. Rather than being seen as a strong voice or a brave truth-teller, she came across as unprepared, emotional, and inconsistent. The more she tried to defend herself afterward, the more her critics pointed back to the interview as evidence of why she was difficult to take seriously. In a way, the interview didn't just damage her, it reshaped her public image completely. And then came the unavoidable comparison to Donald Trump. Every mistake Rosie made, every exaggerated response, and every uncomfortable silence seemed to echo the criticisms Trump had made about her years earlier. What once sounded like personal insults now felt like accurate observations. For Trump's supporters, it was proof that he had seen through her all along. For neutral audiences, it was a reminder that sometimes reputations are not built on rumors. They are built on patterns that eventually reveal themselves. In the end, Rosie's big moment became a cautionary tale about the power of perception. A single interview, if handled poorly, can outweigh years of work. Instead of silencing her critics, Rosie gave them the loudest reason yet to say, Trump was right. What could have been a chance at redemption turned into another controversy added to her long list of public battles. The conclusion was hard to escape. Rosie O'Donnell didn't just lose control of an interview, she lost control of her own narrative.